What's going on, y'all? I'm KM Best, and Nebula is a card that I think has a lot of different applications in Marvel Snap compared to your typical Battle Pass card. Let's jump into some decks and then a discussion of her role in the metagame. So first up, this is a Nebula deck, just a quick variant on the onlystats.com deck, the Miles plus Stature plus Zabu discount deck. This is a straightforward, easy deck to play, where Nebula just serves the role of a beater. She goes big. Alternatives for Nebula in this list include Nightcrawler. Similarly, if you don't have Jeff, you can play Nightcrawler instead. Now, one of the things Nebula does do here is make you a little bit more vulnerable to Killmonger. In exchange, she goes very large sometimes. She dictates opponents' play sometimes. She's a very interesting card in this list, and I don't think the list needs to be built around her to make her good, but this list, I think, is not built around her enough that she becomes a required part of it. She's just, pretty good. Now, does that mean that you're going to be playing her in here 100% of the time? No, you can play Iceman, you can play Nightcrawler. There's plenty of options for that slot. You don't need her for this, but this is a very good deck that she goes in. Now, this brings me to point number one I want to make about Nebula, and it is that the more you build around her, because she is a one-cost card, the more you are vulnerable to Killmonger. The decks that I'm showing you today are going to run the gamut from building around her a lot to not building around her very much at all. This is definitely on the not building around her very much at all side of the spectrum, and depending on how afraid you are of Killmonger, or God forbid, Elektra, you can choose a deck that fits your fear of Killmonger. So this one, not super reliant on her, uses her just as sort of alternate sunspot or just like a one drop that goes pretty big. That's what she does in here, and she does it pretty well. Definitely not required. Next up, we have a Sandman build. Now, this is one card off a build I believe KYB was playing. It is simply replacing Ebony Maw with Nebula in the Sandman list, because obviously if you restrict the amount of cards they can play, it's very hard for them to always put cards in the lane that Nebula is in, and because your deck goes so big, you don't really get sad when you draw her late. So when you draw her late, you're just like, oh, well, I'll be doing something else anyway, who cares? It's the same dynamic as with Ebony Maw. Now, the downside is she is generally not going to be as big as Ebony Maw. The upside is she is not going to restrict your play patterns in the same way as Ebony Maw. Now, you'll notice there's a Black Panther package in this list. It's just so the deck has a little bit of a mix-up here. So you can obviously play the Black Panther and then Odin the Black Panther, or you can play the Black Panther and then Zola the Black Panther. You also get to dodge Shang-Chi if you get to shove priority over to your opponent, which you are able to do some of the time, and Nebula does actually help that compared to Ebony Maw, who could be winning a location on his own. Nebula often won't be that big until the end of the game, meaning it might be impactful for priority. So this is another deck where, again, there are other cards you can run. She might be the best in slot option here. You could also run Iceman in here if you want to disrupt opponents' decks like this. So if you're worried about the mirror, which personally I wouldn't be, you could run Iceman in there. You could put the Ebony Maw back in. There are plenty of options for you at the slot. I suspect that she is one of the more competitive options at that slot. It is still too early for me to tell you this is the best option at that slot for this deck. I don't honestly know. But I do think it provides an interesting tool to a deck that doesn't have a lot of early game plays. Another option in this list, you can play Jeff. Now, we have opted against that. We're very much all in on drawing Electro, but hey, if we're all in on drawing Electro, Nebula into Electro, kind of actually sick. So let's move on to the next deck here. This is a deck that actually does leverage her pretty well, but it does so without being super vulnerable to Killmonger because of the other cards you can play on the Storm. So this is sort of what I think is a good balance between a Nebula deck that really goes hard on location denial and thus is vulnerable to late Killmongers, and a deck that doesn't really need Nebula but just runs her as a good card. This, of course, it does run her as a good card, but also she has a ton of upside with Storm. There's a lot of cards in this deck that have a ton of upside with Storm. Morbius on Storm, Dracula on Storm. In fact, one of the most difficult things in this deck is figuring out how much to invest in your Storm lane if one of those cards is already on it, given what your opponent's potential range on turn 4 is after you play the Storm. Now, I do think she's not necessarily required here, but I personally think she's the strongest option. This deck is the deck that gets played against me a lot by a player named Perry, and I talked to him about it just a little bit. He thinks if you don't have Nebula, Iceman is great. If you don't want to be vulnerable to Killmonger, Iceman is arguably better. Nebula is a more powerful card, but more vulnerable to Killmonger, and I think that's a pretty good dynamic for the card to have, and it's going to be one of those things you're going to keep hearing about, because as a one-cost card, she is going to be defined by the things that kill her in the metagame. If she ever gets too strong and Killmonger gets too everywhere, well, you kind of know what that means. As far as this deck goes, I think it's sincerely underrated. One of the things that you're going to have to do a lot with this deck, though, is get into the head of your opponent and play what you think they would do, and then make the play that beats that. There are a lot of turn 6s in this deck that are very dependent on, well, if I go here and they do this, I lose, but if I go here and they do this, I win. And that is going to be one of the big determinants of whether or not you're good at this deck or not, is how easily you are able to understand the ranges of your opponents and incorporate them into your game plan. This is a pure control list, a pure 100% control list that is built to be a control list. It is all in on Nebula working. It is a fantastic deck. And it was played against me, of course, by a player who viewers of my channel might be familiar with, Get Wrecked. It is a great deck. I do feel like once you understand what you're playing against with this list, it is a lot easier to understand and a lot easier to play against. The fact that there's only the Spider-Woman in there as a way to go tall on lanes is relevant, but she is, a lot of the time a 12 power card that can't get Shang-Chi'd. That's definitely cool. This list is going to test your knowledge of how to play Titania well, and it's also going to test your patience when you draw these hands that do not involve playing a card until like turn 3. So this is definitely a finicky deck. You're going to get a lot of very close wins with it, and you're going to have to be very sure about what you're doing when you play it. However, it leverages Nebula very powerfully. I know the deck creator, Get Wrecked, is open to the idea of Nightcrawler in it as well. I personally think that the power output of Nebula is strong enough to justify the swap, but again, this is a deck that leverages location shutdown. Of course, Nightcrawler is also very good here. So I think overall, my verdict on Nebula is that she's a little bit overrated. I think people have come to the conclusion where it's like, wow, this is just Sunspot. It's just like the best one drop in the game. And I don't think that's true. I think she actually has many peers depending on what you are trying to do. Now, the fact that she is so strong makes her vulnerable to Killmonger, and that impacts how strong she can be in the context of the metagame. And I know it's not fair to be like, oh, well, it dies to removal. It's good. Like, I get it. But there are cards you can play that when they get Killmongered, you don't care. Iceman, Korg, like these are things that do their ability, and then if they're playing Killmonger or whatever, you already got what you needed to get out of them. As far as other decks that can play Nebula, I know the Moon Girl She-Hulk deck, people have been playing Nebula in that. She is currently in my list as a sort of flex spot. I am not a big believer in the Goblin Titania build of that list. I personally feel as though it's sort of going too far in the weeds. Simplify it down, just play good cards and do your little combo thing. I will say decks with Storm are very good against the Moon Girl She-Hulk deck. Here, let me just pull that up for you so you can see what I'm talking about here. This is the Moon Girl She-Hulk Hitmonkey deck. I have Nebula in it, but again, one of the things I like about this list is how hard it is to actually land a tech card against it. And if you're investing in Sunspot and Nebula, you are going to be vulnerable to Killmonger. Alternatives for Nebula here include Bishop. There's also, like I said, there have been people who've been trying around the Killmonger Titania, or the Titania and Goblin version of this deck. I personally am not a fan of that. I talked to the deck's creator, What Am I, and he said he didn't feel like it was the exact correct way for the deck to go. I think he said something along the lines of, it makes you feel very smart, but it's just worse overall. And that's sort of where my head is at with this. I just felt better every time I played this as opposed to when I was playing the Goblin Titania stuff. There's too much conflict with what your main game plan is, to me, to justify doing that. But as is, I think this is a totally viable shell for Nebula, but it's another shell where you don't really need her. You could very easily just play the free-to-play card Bishop. So as far as overall verdict, Nebula is a really strong card that is balanced by being a 1-cost, and the fact that if you want to make her good, you kind of have to play protection for the Killmonger, you play an armor or whatever, unless you're trying to free roll her, is a significant cost. She's powerful, but there are several other cards that I think are just as powerful. Korg, Iceman, Sunspot, Kitty Pryde hopefully, whenever she comes back, and Nightcrawler. Like, these are cards that you can play that have significant upside depending on what your game plan is that might end up better than her. Now, does that mean that she's not worth buying? No, I think she actually definitely is worth buying, because you need to find out, like, if a card is this strong, if they released Iceman on the Battle Pass, you'd buy that Battle Pass, and she is up there with the top tier of 1-cost cards. I just think she's not as exciting as some of the other cards on the Battle Pass. People talk about how she's not a build-around, but it's hard for a 1-cost card to be a build-around if they want that card to be good. Now, finally, if I were to give her a rating on my star system for rating new cards, I would say Nebula is a light 4 to a strong 3. I'm not 100% sure. I have a lot of decks that I like her in, but she's sort of a card that can go in and out depending on what you expect to see. I think she's simultaneously overrated. People thought that she was one of the best cards in the game, just period. I don't think she's that. And underappreciated because she needs certain contexts to thrive, and in those contexts, she will be phenomenal. What are your thoughts on Nebula? I'm interested to hear what you think about the newest Battle Pass card in Marvel Snap. I personally, I like her. I'm a big fan of her. She's not like super exciting. I think it's a really interesting design, and I think a lot of people were worried she was going to be broken, and she's not. She's just good. She's just a good card. I like that. I like what she is. And as always, remember, hit those buttons that give me dopamine, like and subscribe, leave a comment. I'll see you next time.